Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning, Vietnam! I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
I feel the need for speed.
Roads? No, we don't need roads. Snakes. Why'd it have to be snakes?
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Batman.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Moviescramble podcast. We are down a musketeer tonight. It is just myself and John, and we're going to do things a little bit differently. Not because Simmy's not here, but purely because the cinemas aren't open. So we've decided to curate a bit of a Hitchcock retrospective, and we are kicking things off with 1964's Marnie and 1958's Vertigo. Now, no matter what your opinion is on Hitchcock, he is undoubtedly one of the most influential filmmakers of all time. Whether you agree with his sexual politics or not, there's no denying that he has had one of the biggest impacts on cinema of any director you can possibly think of. So, without further ado, let's dive into our first movie tonight, which is Marnie.
You know what I am. I'm Minnie Q Thief. I'm a thief and a liar and...
Well, it seems to be my misfortune to have fallen in love with a thief and a liar.
In love? Oh, Mark, if you love me, you'll let me go.
Did you have a tough childhood, Mrs. Taylor?
Not particularly.
I think you did. I think you've had a hard, tough climb.
You don't love me. I'm just something you've caught. You think I'm some kind of animal you've trapped.
That's right, you are. And I've caught something really wild this time, haven't I? I've tracked you and caught you, and by God, I'm going to keep you.
It stars Tippi Hedren and the dearly departed Sean Connery, who actually only passed a few short weeks ago. And the film focuses around the titular character, Marnie, who is something of an elusive thief who appears to flip from job to job, managing to steal from her bosses along the way. She manages to get so far along until she meets Mark, played by Sean Connery, who catches her in the act and forces her to marry him as a weird way of punishment. John, this is your first time watching Marnie in quite a while. What was your thoughts kind of looking back on it?
Initially, I was very surprised that I didn't really relate to the sexual politics of it in any way. It did date it in quite a big way, I must say. Mm-hmm. And I almost felt a little bit disappointed with the film when I watched it. I didn't connect with a lot of the characters and I didn't get as much out of it as I thought. Now, what I did was I watched it again about 2 or 3 days ago. I'd watched it maybe about 3 weeks ago. And the second watch of it, I far more enjoyed, just because I got really, really into it this time. It was almost like a completely different film for me, just because of the way that I approached it the second time, knowing the sexual politics of the time and not discounting that, but putting that to the side and focusing more on the story elements and the various Hitchcock elements that tend to crop up on an awful lot of these films. So yeah, I did actually really enjoy it, and I surprised myself by saying that for the second time, but I did get more out of it. What did you think?
Yeah, no, I can understand where you're coming from. When I watched this was a few weeks ago, I was kind of appalled. I know that Hitchcock's got some, there's some issues and misogyny that kind of peppered through his entire portfolio of work. But watching this was so striking because, every single woman that you meet in the plot is really problematic. Marnie herself is a thief. Her mother is obviously, the reformed whore or whatever you want to call it. And there's Mark's sister-in-law who's like jealous and scheming, and all these like horrible female characters, and there was nothing in it that I could connect to at all. Not even when Marnie is showing her vulnerable side and she's talking about her upbringing, her past. There was so much for it to me that was just so. It just felt really alienating because it was very, very like, look at all these problem women with their emotional issues. Like it just felt like that watching it. I actually thought it was quite an interesting performance from Sean Connery. I've not really seen, I've seen some of his work. I've seen like Highlander and The Untouchables and stuff like that, but I've never seen him in a kind of like serious early role apart from James Bond. So I was intrigued by his performance. But again, it's kind of marred by the whole sexual assault controversy because there obviously is a rape scene or an alluded rape scene as well. And for me, it was just there was all the traits of a Hitchcock movie. You know, there was, you know, at one point I actually think that Marnie actually calls herself Marion when she's on the run, which of course is a straight lift out of Psycho. But for me, it felt, for someone who loves frenzy, I found this movie quite alienating, actually. Did you think that, I mean, for me, it didn't really feel like a Hitchcock at times. Did you kind of get that impression as well, or? It
did, and I can understand why a lot of people think it is a sort of a second-tier Hitchcock film. Mm-hmm. Basically because it doesn't have the same shock value as a lot of Hitchcock films have. There's usually some sort of terrifying thriller element to them, and they're marketed in that way, and they deliver. But in this case, it was more of a psychological thriller than anything else. It was more about Marnie's internal struggles rather than her external struggles, so it was a wee bit more difficult to tune into. I thought that the central performance it must have been a very difficult one, because it's a difficult character to kind of get your head around. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking in terms of actors getting their head around certain characters, because this isn't a conventional female lead character at all. There's a lot of depth to her, but there's a lot of trauma there as well. And at times she seems overly hysterical, but that's all fitting with the character as well. That's what she is actually like, and that's what she comes across as, which is difficult to understand at first, but then you do get there and you kind of say, right, yeah, that's why she's acting in that way. That's why she's aloof, or she's almost like being out of her own body at times, in terms of like a reaction to everyone around her. A whole theme running through it where she can't be touched in any way. She just doesn't want the touch of a man or anybody. Obviously that relates back to something that happened to her previously. I'm trying to avoid spoilers, obviously, because I want people to see this film, even if they haven't seen it for years. It's one of these films that you should take a look at occasionally, just to refresh your memory on it. But yeah, as I said, there's that element of where she doesn't want to be touched, but then you get to a point where she's interacting with her mother, and her mother doesn't want to be touched either. So you say, well, is this where she's getting it from? So there's lots of wee nice elements that are sort of brought in, add to the intrigue, and it kind of fills out the story an awful lot more, because if you just look at the story on its own, it's almost like a compulsive thief. She's stealing this money, changing her identity, moving on, doing exactly the same thing. But it's not as if she's doing it like sort of often. She takes a good long while. It's like a sort of one of these long cons, if you like. She gets herself settled into a place, steals a substantial amount of money, moves on to the next one, does the same thing again. But there's this whole compulsion about her, which it plays really well. But in the way that they try to get that across, is they take I was surprised actually how much they took their time with this film, because obviously there's the initial scene where she's working in an office and she goes through the whole process of stealing everything and all that, and you get introduced to the character of Mark quite early on, because he's a client of theirs, and then it takes you from there, and it basically takes you through everything. There's no secrecy about what she does. There's no mystery or anything. The mystery is all about herself. It's all within her mind and everything like that. So it's a strange one. It's not a straightforward story as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, I think that, and it kind of sets a tone from that, because once you see her you kind of realise that she's the woman they're talking about that's stolen from the office. She goes home to visit her mother, and she kind of, as you say, it kind of looks like she's having this sort of out-of-body experience. Her eyes aren't quite focused, and, you know, she says something to her mum about, you know, yeah, that's because you don't really love me. And straight away you're like, oh, wow, this is kind of like, she's a very emotionally complex character. And in a way, it kind of reminded me almost of like Sally Bowles from Cabaret, that kind of vulnerable sort of Liza Minnelli performance. Now, I know a lot of people watch that movie and get annoyed by Liza Minnelli's performance. And similarly, I know a lot of people watch Marnie and think it's, you know, it's over the top kind of histrionic sort of thing. So I think there is a kind of overlap there of that kind of vulnerable woman who doesn't really know how to express herself. So she chooses to do it through these kind of like, you know, overwhelming tears and sobbing and all that sort of thing. But it kind of plunges you straight into maybe the mind of the character straight away by just that one kind of, as I say, she kind of zones out momentarily and just says, yeah, but you don't really love me, mum. And then she kind of zones back in and of course, no, you do, and it all kind of falls back into place again. And it's like she kind of starts to repeat herself. But yeah, I think that her and Mark are nice contrasts to each other, because not that I'm saying that Sean Connery's not got much range, but he's quite a stoic character. Like, he's very, like, you know, he's supposed to be this kind of businessman, and he just sort of, you know, he does what he wants to do, and there's a process from A to B, and he's going to, you know, help to fix Marnie and blah, blah, blah. And it's all very logical. And I mean, maybe that says a wee bit about gender stereotypes of the time, that she's kind of over the top and he's more quiet and logical, but they make a neat contrast to each other physically as well, because he obviously towers over her, and you know, this Sean Connery kind of at peak sort of physical fitness and everything. But I like this sort of explicitly, although I did find it quite alienating in terms of the sort of maybe themes or whatever. I liked Tippi Hedren's performance. It's definitely a lot more, we get to see a lot more of her here than we ever did in The Birds, for example. What kind of elements would you say in the movie did you feel were sort of typically Hitchcockian, if we can use that as a descriptive word? What kind of elements in the movie made you feel like, okay, I'm in it now, I'm watching a Hitchcock movie?
Well, there's the Hitchcock blonde element, because Marnie goes from being this black-haired Raven-esque figure to a blonde when she changes herself, and it's done in a very dramatic way. There's Marnie's theme playing underneath it as she's like rinsing out all the black from her hair, and then she sweeps her hair back and it's all blonde.
Can I just say, as a blonde, that would never happen. Like, that's one thing that really pisses me off about films, is like people dye their hair blonde overnight. But yeah, no, sorry for interrupting. It was one of those points in the movie when I watched it and I was like, oh, here we go again. She's dyed her hair blonde in one shot.
Yeah, I mean, that wee bit reminded me of Gilda.
Oh, yeah.
You're introduced to the character of Gilda, and it's the sweep of the hair back and all that. Yeah. So you could tell it was a Hitchcock film from certain elements. There was a lot of the back projection, which he tended to use quite a lot. There was also the matte painting at one point of the big ship at the end of the street.
That was cracking.
He got pelters for that at the time because it was so old-fashioned looking and everything, yeah. There was the use of the likes of fake thunder and lightning, because thunder and lightning, I don't know, I've never been in a situation where thunder and lightning are like you get in the movies, where it's just this massive big flash in front, just behind you in the screen and all this sort of stuff.
Just enough to beautifully light you. Yeah. So there was all that, and obviously the use of like colours. Crimson is used an awful lot in the film to signify danger. It's like a trigger colour, and that's something that he uses an awful lot. And well, there was 3 particular scenes that I thought were very Hitchcockian. One was the kiss between them. After, I think it's actually in that same scene where there's the thunder and lightning and the stuff comes, all the stuff crashes into his office, and he kisses her, but he kisses her by kind of moving his mouth down her face, and it's very close up, and it's just it looks absolutely fantastic, and it looks obviously very erotic and everything. I mean, there was an interview with Tippi Hedren about it, and she said there was nothing even alluring about it. It's a very technical shot. All the lights are really close in. The camera was about a foot away from her, you know. So, but that kind of element was sort of typical Hitchcock. There was another one where there was a party where they were having the big party, and there's a crane shot where the camera slowly descends down the stairs, and you're kind of thinking, right, what's going on here? You know, there's something happening. And it opens the door, and it's a big surprise. It's a surprise reveal in the door, which was excellent. That really reminded me of him. That really reminded me of, do you know, the shot in Notorious where it goes down the stairs and then you just see the key in her hand? That I was like, this is like the exact same shot. But I get what you mean.
And there was a third one where she is stealing money from Mark's firm, and the way the camera is positioned, it's positioned right in the middle. So half of the shot is taken up with her. It's a long shot, so you see the entirety of the office. So you see her actually in opening up the safe and everything, and then at the same time the cleaner coming in the other half. And it's just the way that it's positioned. It's just like, you couldn't really think. I mean, you've seen it done so many other times since then. Tarantino's very open about his influences, and one of his influences was this type of long shot that they tended to use. But Hitchcock was one of the sort of the pioneers, the first one that really sort of brought it to the fore, Hollywood film. So through that, you can tell, this is a typical Alfred Hitchcock film, and it kind of puts you at ease as well, because you know you're in good hands. You know that all the building blocks are there, so you can enjoy the whole film because of that, because all the elements are there for you to, you know, work on. You don't think, oh no, this is going to be a wee bit different. It's going to be, you know. And then, of course,
I
you
think-
put Bernard Herrmann's score.
Yeah, of course, and even just the costume. I'm pretty sure it's Edith Head. The costumes for this as well. The suits are very safe. You know that like they're very familiar. Even if you don't even know anything about movies, you look at the styles that Marnie's wearing, and even the kind of sort of, I don't know if you call it like golf club sort of esque gear that Mark features in quite a lot. You know, like the whites and the cottons and stuff like that. And I feel like that's quite comforting as well. To me, it does feel like a different Hitchcock film. It doesn't feel like, your big kind of blockbuster like, your Psycho or The Birds or whatever, because there's no clear and present threat. It's all, as you say, internalized. But yeah, there are obviously elements. And as I said earlier on, there's one scene where she's driving away, and I think she actually uses the name Marion, and it just reminded me straight away of Psycho, of her leaving the office, having done the same there. For one of the things that I'd read while I was kind of looking this up was some kind of reviewers and sort of theorists and whatever had said that they see Mark as Marnie's saviour. And that thought had just never occurred to me, because I used to sort of crack the joke that the only reason he helps her out is because he's desperate for getting his hole, basically. But on reflection, I can see why some people kind of, because he does kind of go through a wee bit of a personality change. At first, he's very rough and aggressive, and he just wants a wife to perform wifely duties, if we can put it that way. But there is a sort of softening to him. Do you buy into that whole concept of him being her saviour, or is that too much of a stretch?
Not so much a saviour, but the way I looked on it, he was treating her like a project. He was treating her like a scientific experiment, because he was using psychological techniques to try and get to the bottom of her psychosis, for a better word. But he was also applying, he said he had like a background in zoological studies and everything, so he was applying that kind of thing to it as well, the kind of fight or flight elements that Marnie kind of showed in certain places. So yeah, I can see why he was trying to, from a psychological point of view, he was trying to fix her, so therefore he was trying to save her. But it did seem as if he was doing this for other reasons as well, rather than just getting, obviously, he was just wanting to get his end away, but which I didn't quite understand, because obviously back at the house there was it Lil?
Yeah, Lil, the sister, or her sister-in-law. Yeah,
it would have been weirder if it was his sister.
The
sister-in-law, who was obviously totally in love with him, and he wanted nothing to do with her. I don't think she was interesting enough.
For me, it was she wasn't a challenge, because she was so obviously infatuated, and the fact that this woman was actually physically, like, obviously this was news to him that women could be physically repulsed by him, but I think that made it more exciting, which is wrong on so many levels. But I think it was the fact that Lil was literally throwing herself at him, and that was of no interest to him, which kind of ties in with what I was going to say next. The one sort of section of the movie that I feel has aged horribly, only because of the special effects that were available at the time, is the hunt. So obviously a massive visual metaphor for, kind of Marnie and her life, and Mark sort of chasing her and whatever. But that is the only bit of the film that made me kind of cringe a wee bit. I actually loved the big matte painting with the ship. That's really sweet. But the sort of bad visual effects of people getting thrown off horses and stuff like that has aged quite tremendously, I think.
It's not really lasted, shall we say.
Yeah.
There was actually quite a lot of work involved putting all that together. There was obviously the location work, but there was work done in the studio for it as well. Now, for the close-ups of Tippi Hedren on the horse, it was actually a mechanical horse that they used for it. But you never really saw that, because it was all close-ups on her expressions and everything. And apparently the mechanical horse came from Disney. It was one that they had, and it was the best in the business at the time. So they hired it in order to use it. But they also used a treadmill in the studio with real horses for part of it, because if you see some of the scenes, you'll see that, especially Lil, she is actually riding a real horse, but she never actually did any location shooting. She did all her shooting in the studio. So this massive treadmill that they used for it, apparently that Hitchcock wanted as much realism as possible, because using fake horses kind of, like you say, it could have looked a lot worse, and you didn't need like close-ups on every single member of the hunt. So they had to get people with real horses. So he suggested using the treadmill, and everybody was saying, "Are you nuts? You can't use a treadmill on horses. You're wanting horses to run on this thing." And he says, "Yeah, why not?" And just because it hadn't been done before, there was no reason why they couldn't do it. And they brought the treadmill and trained up the horses. But apparently, Tippi Hedren as well trained for 3 months on her horse for those scenes.
Okay.
So it would be more realistic that she was like totally into horses and everything. And I quite like that element of the story as well. Obviously, she had her own horse that she used some of the stolen money for the upkeep of it and everything. So that was almost like a grounding mechanism for her. She needed, there was a reason for her to do what she was doing. It wasn't just about taking money. It wasn't for that. It was for, obviously, to try and show her mother that she was successful, and also to sort of help ground herself by being able to go riding this horse and just losing herself in her thoughts and everything. So yeah, that was good. But yeah, when she fell over the wall, it didn't really work.
Which again kind of really took me out of it. But actually, I get what you're saying, because there was like, I'm not saying it sort of repeated itself, but it did in a sense, and that every so often, once she had maybe, I don't know, stolen from another place or had a confrontation with her mother, she came back to the riding yard, and it was quite clear that this was the thing that was sort of keeping her happy, and you could tell that she was like almost like a different person, like their posture and everything changed, and she was happy when she was out riding the horse. But yeah, the kind of hunt scene in itself, I was just like, oh man, that's just taking me right out of it. And the thing is, as I say, as alienating as some of the kind of politics and stuff was, I was enjoying it, and I was enjoying her performance. I was also reading actually that I think they asked Grace Kelly to take on the main role, like to play Marnie, but apparently the Kingdom of Monaco said they would not have their princess playing a thief. And I just wonder, like, Grace Kelly to me was always very like delicate and composed and kind of icy, I think, as well. She was quite good at doing that kind of standoffish, aloof type of woman. I don't know if it'd be the same movie if it was her in the lead role.
No, originally, like you say, it was meant for her. It was supposed to be the film that Hitchcock was going to do right after Psycho, I believe. And he'd bought the rights to Marnie based on the fact that it would have been perfect for Grace Kelly. And apparently they had agreed to do it, and she'd got agreement from her husband and everything, but the film got delayed, I think it was. And then Grace had some sort of marriage difficulties, which meant that her husband was just like, no, I don't think it's a good idea if you start going back and doing other films. And Hitchcock quite gracefully accepted it and says, it's just a film, there will be other times, which obviously there weren't. Yeah, she was set for coming back, and the agreements and everything were in place for it. So to rejig it afterwards, obviously they went on and was it The Birds that came after?
Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously Tippi Hedren was in that, and her performance in that got her the gig in Marnie as well.
Yeah, you would think after all the...
No,
I was just going to say, you would think after all the bodily torture she went through in The Birds, she'd be like, fuck working with this guy again.
Yeah, but it must be very difficult to say no to somebody like Hitchcock, and be in one of his films.
Yeah.
Apparently, the original story from which it came, it was a love triangle between Mark and Marnie and another man who worked alongside him. And that character was replaced by Lil.
Well, that changes the dynamic completely,
It
though.
changed it, yes. Yeah. Because apparently it was more a straightforward story in that way. 2 guys and one girl, which is something that has been done a number of times in Hitchcock films. There seems to always this sort of love triangle element, but it was something, well, it had been done before, and we will talk about that in a couple of minutes, obviously, but I felt it did kind of change the dynamic. It would have been a different type of film if it had been 2 males in it. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think the whole sort of Marnie's the kind of centre point of all of this, and obviously because she is the kind of thief who's like on the run or whatever, but also there's so much contrast in the relationship between her and Mark. Her and Lil are physically and emotionally very different people as well. Lil comes across quite strong-willed, quite determined, and she's this little petite brunette, whereas Marnie's obviously the blonde by this point as well. And obviously there's the really awkward dynamic between her and her mother as well. And I can't remember the actress's name, but I'm pretty sure she was not that much older than Tippi Hedren, and they've totally like grey-haired her, like sprayed the talc on and drawn some wrinkles on. But she is at the centre of all of this, obviously being the sort of titular character. And I think that if you'd have brought something else into the mix, I think a love triangle would have undermined the whole story of unraveling who Marnie is. This is a very much a female-led movie, and it's her story and how she chooses to tell it and when she chooses to allow it to come out fully. And I think if you just want a love triangle in the mix, it would have got a bit corny, I think. I mean, as I've already said, the misogyny and whatever is quite clear throughout. I think adding another guy into the mix would have just made things a bit cringy. I don't know.
Yeah. Just thinking back on the character of the mother, there's a nice element of German expressionism in there as well, where I think she comes up to see Marnie when after she's told her to go to bed for a nap in the afternoon of all things, and she comes up to see her, and then she walks down the stairs and you see the shadow. The stairs. It's very sort of Nosferatu. You're kind of going, I've seen that before. I know what that is. Great. I understand. I know films.
Yeah, I know. That's when you do feel like you're sitting there with your kind of scholar hat on, going, "Oh yeah, I get all these references, mate. I know what you're doing." Yeah, I mean, I think that it's definitely a film that's worth watching. I think it's a film it's quite shocking, but not in the usual hit. Like, you know, there's not going to be the getting stabbed in the shower or the screeching violins or anything like that. But it is a film that will shock you. I'm not sure it's a film that many people could emotionally connect with, but I think that's kind of the point as well. I think the whole point is you are supposed to be alienated by her because that's how all the other characters around her feel. But I definitely think it's worth watching. I can see why some people think it's like a kind of B movie or whatever, or it's not top tier, but I think there are good solid performances in there, and there's very, you know, clear Hitchcockian tropes or whatever you want to call them. I think it's definitely an interesting movie, and I think that when you look at, you know, Hitchcock's films sort of going from, you know, the early stuff like The Lodger and stuff like that right through to, I think is it Family Plot, that's the last one, you can kind of chart where he is emotionally as well himself. You know, there's a lot of frustrations and studio things and stuff like that as well, and I like this because it's quite garish, it's quite brash, the colours are very loud. You know, she goes from the extreme black hair to the brassy blonde, and there's a lot of contrast in it, and I kind of love it for that. But as I say, it's not a film that you're going to go into and you're going to feel this. It's not going to make you scared, and it's not going to make you connect with people. It does kind of make you feel a wee bit on the outside, but I think that's okay. I think that's the point of it. Would you agree?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, totally. It's... As I said at the top of the podcast, it was one that I didn't connect with the first time, but I understood it better the second time because I went into it with a slightly different attitude. If you go in with sort of more traditional attitudes, like you say, if you're hoping to root for somebody or you're wanting to get scared or frightened from the master of suspense, then you may not get that here, but it's definitely a rewarding film. It really is. Yeah.
I know, I definitely agree. I think that I suppose there's one connection between Marnie and Vertigo, is that they're both based on books, and seemingly what Hitchcock used to do was like blind buy books. Like he would go in with like a fake name and stuff like that because he knew that if he went in as Alfred Hitchcock, people would charge him a fortune for the rights. So he decided just to go in as like, you know, Joe Bloggs or whatever, and that's how he acquired all these really cool scripts. So yeah, I mean, the next film we're going to look at is 1958's Vertigo. It stars my beloved Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak.
Vertigo, a feeling of dizziness, a swimming in the head. Figuratively, a state in which all things seem to be engulfed in a whirlpool of terror, as created by Alfred Hitchcock in the story that gives new meaning to the word suspense.
We'll just ignore the fact that there was like a 40-year age gap between them and, you know, they're obviously playing romantic interest in the film. That's fine. The movie's it's an interesting one. It regularly tops the sort of Sight and Sound, you know, top 100 movies of all time ever. It's considered a total masterpiece classic. There's, again, a wee bit like Marnie, there's so much of it that's very, very obviously Hitchcock, and there's so much of it that is like wild and really progressive and really new and exciting. It centres around the character of Scotty, played by James Stewart, and he is hired by a former friend, because he used to be a private detective, to track down his friend's wife, Madeline. And he thinks that his wife has gone crazy. She's convinced that she's something to do with an old painting, and he's asked basically Scotty to put on his detective hat one last time and work out what's going on. Now, Scotty has been in an accident. He nearly fell off a roof and has hurt himself. So he's suffering from vertigo, which is where the film gets the title from. Ta-da! And so he's sort of dealing with this kind of illness, a wee bit like Rear Window. He's kind of debilitated by his current situation. So he's dealing with this illness while he's also trying to track down this mysterious woman who, of course, again, is the classic, beautiful Hitchcock blonde in a stunning grey-fitted suit. It's been a while for me since I have seen the movie. I don't think I've actually watched it since uni. John, was this a recent watch for you, or is this something you've come back to?
It's something I've come back to. I've seen this film maybe 4 or 5 times over the years. It's been a couple of years since I've watched it, to be perfectly honest, and I was interested to watch it because I don't think I'd seen the restored version of it, which was the one on the DVD and Blu-ray release, which is kicking about just now. So yeah, it was something that I thought I was familiar with, but with all Hitchcock films, there's always elements that are there to surprise you. The first one was the way that the first 10 minutes of the film basically tells pretty much all of the story for you. Yep. It introduces the character of Scotty, it introduces how he got agoraphobia and therefore vertigo. It introduces Midge, his friend, and who's madly in love with him.
But firmly in the friend zone.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Because she wears glasses and she has short hair.
And then, like you say, it introduces the character that I've forgotten the name, his friend, who he goes and visits and takes up the offer. And then at the end of roughly about 10 minutes, he sees Madeline for the first time. And it's just, you can just see in his eyes that he's already completely obsessed by her. And it's a fantastic way to open a film. There's very few films that do that. A lot of them tend to tease things out for you, and they don't kind of set the stall out right away. But this one totally does. It's in the same way that it completely unrelated, but Die Hard does exactly the same thing. The first 10 minutes, if you watch that again, everything you need to know about that film happens in the first 10 minutes. It's absolutely phenomenal. But it works really well because of that, because you're set up in that way, you just love what happens after that. It's probably what you would call a typical Hitchcock film, because, like you say, it's got the elements of the older detective, it's got the blonde, it's got the elements, the mystery elements, it's got the fantastic locations, it's got the cars, it's got, I mean, the suits, absolutely brilliant. And as I noted on Marnie discussion, there's a scene quite early on where he's talking, when him and Midge are talking, and he says, "Oh, you remember we were engaged for 3 months?" And just right at that moment, the camera is so close up to her face just to get her reaction, and it's only her eyes that move, nothing else moves. And then it goes back to the sort of wide shot of Scotty lounging on the couch as if, you know, he's just made a funny remark. And then he says, "Oh yeah, but you broke it off after 3 weeks." And it goes back to the same shot of her. And she just does exactly the same. She just looks at him through the frame of her glasses. And it's just this, you know nothing, mister. You're just so out of touch with what I'm actually feeling here. Just, it's amazing. Such a perfect sort of way to get that whole dynamic between the two of them across.
Well, that's the thing, and they often refer to, you know, the sort of icy blonde, and the character of Madeline, certainly, you know, nothing is given away. Like, she's very stoic, and, you know, there's the kind of issues of, you know, does she have mental health issues or, you know, emotional issues, whatever. But again, almost in a sort of, you know, turning Marnie on its head, Jimmy Stewart's the one who's consumed by his emotions and, you know, literally just like following, you know, his lust for this woman that he's just seen and completely become enraptured with, whereas she's very aloof and standoffish, and, you know, she wants to just, you know, gaze at her painting, and she's very calm and collected and everything's very suave. So there's quite a kind of contrast to what was happening in Marnie. My first kind of thought when I watched it was, one, the title credits are just stunning. It's like trippy. And again, I don't feel like that's very Hitchcockian, but it kind of sucks you in because you're like, oh, there's all these colours and they're kind of swimming around and there's kind of graphic, and you're like, what is this? And you get sucked into, you know, every bit as much as the character of Scotty does. But my first kind of thing is like, this is the most luscious, beautiful to look at episode of Columbo I've ever seen, because it does tell you the entire plot in the first 10 minutes and you know exactly what's going to happen, but that doesn't take away from the fact that everything is like, there's not a thing out of place. And when you watch it, like, you really have to watch it because everything in every scene. There could be, a flower or a necklace or a particular carpet or a curtain, and everything means something. And obviously they use this colour palette of red and green, like quite obviously as markers throughout. And once you start paying attention to that, you're like, that car's green, that carpet's green, those grapes are green, those curtains are, and you just see everywhere. And you kind of get sucked into this, almost like, I'm not saying like on the same scale as the character of Scotty, but you're seeing things everywhere that you just assume is dripping with subtext. And whether that was a conscious choice or not, I'm quite sure it was. But you become sucked into this little world of Scotty and Madeline and their relationship. And I understand why a lot of people think that I think Vertigo's quite a Marmite film. I think some people really don't like it, and obviously other people think it's the best film of all time. I love it. I think it's one of the strongest Hitchcocks. I think it's, and they go back, and as you said, it's got the locations, it's got the cars, it's got the suits, and it's got everything you want from a good movie to sort of keep you hooked from start to finish. Because, obviously we're not doing spoilers, but there is quite a big switch and dynamic maybe 3/4 of the way through the movie, and again it takes you on this other sort of trip as well. But looking at it, you can see like, oh well, I think I recognise like David Lynch in that, or I recognise Tarantino. And of course there's their famous Vertigo scene, which it's only just occurred to me is like damn near exactly the opening sequence of Mad Men, which I never had noticed before. But I was sitting watching that going, I recognise that, how do I know that? And I was like, that's Mad Men. It's the exact same thing. And it's amazing that film, that actually bombed and was really commercially just was a disaster, is still having that much influence on another kind of iconic, kind of aloof cult TV program.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why some people don't connect to it is because there's not an abundance of story to it. And the film takes its time telling that story. If you think about it, there's a sequence of maybe about 15 minutes where all that you're seeing is Scotty following Madeline. So he's driving, and there's a lot of reprojection and stuff like that. Again, you're going, I recognise that. But anyway, but he follows her about. So you see him driving. It doesn't just cut from one to the other to all the places that she actually goes to. You get all the bits in between of him just following her and tailing her, and then she goes in to buy the flowers, the bouquet of flowers, and there's an extended period there where you're just soaking in this character of Madeline, because she's not doing anything. All Scotty's doing is watching her, obviously getting more and more obsessed as time goes on. You can see it in his eyes, it's almost it almost becomes something physical in him because of the way he reacts to her. Because of that, because of the whole time that it takes, a lot of people could be going, this is kind of a bit boring, this is really, But for anybody who actually likes that sort of thing, and I hold my hand up for that, it's perfect, and it works really well for me. So yes, I fully understand why people would get annoyed by it, but they're wrong.
What I love as well is that between the two characters, between Scotty and Madeline, you don't have a reliable narrator, essentially, because there's major question marks over, at what point does Scotty stop being the detective and what point is he just a fucking stalker? And at the same time, you've got this Matt who you've been set up to believe is losing her mind. So straight away, that little idea has been dropped, and you're like, okay, well, we can't trust her either because she's clearly up to something. So the film doesn't ever let you rest, because it does make you question everything that you're seeing. You're like, oh, well, was that right? Or did it, did she look that way? Or what was that? Was there the way somebody said something in a slight tone? Was that something to do with, So it does kind of make you question a lot of, what you're seeing, which again, obviously kind of plays into this whole idea of, he's kind of losing his mind throughout it as well. One thing that I thought you would appreciate actually is it claims to be the film with the first known use of the trombone shot, right? So there's the scene, obviously, to make the stairs look longer and to emphasize this, height and sense of vertigo. But I swear that when we watched M, when the mother leans over the banister to try and call her child up for dinner, and they claim that's the first trombone shot. I think that was done decades before.
I think with most things like that, when they claim to be the first, it's usually the first commercial use of it, commercially seen use of it, rather than, if you think about it, how many people would have seen M in the 1950s?
We're so cultured.
And again, they use the same shot. They used that in Marnie as well, didn't they? They used a trombone shot actually
I think,
in the final act of the film in the mother's house that they elongated the room and bedroom behind it. Yes. Yeah, it's strange how these things actually sort of gain some notoriety for that sort of thing. It was used quite sparingly as well. They used it maybe 3 times, I think.
Yeah, it's not like, heights. It's not overdone. That would just become cartoonish. But when it is used, it's used very, very effectively. And I think that, without going into too much detail, the scenes that they use them in obviously are this bell tower, and that in itself makes me feel ill because I just think claustrophobia, really dark, really tight space. And when it does sort of draw itself up like that, you are kind of a bit like, whoop, that looks like a long way to the bottom. So when it's used, the effect is incredible because it's not over the top. And I think, Hitchcock, for all his sort of, hyperbole and drama and all that sort of thing, he was never clownish and never cartoonish, and I think that's why this works particularly well. That shot, whether it is the first one to use it or not, I don't know, but the shot does work.
What did you think of the sort of supporting characters in this? Do you think they were too far in the background and it was just really focusing on the sort of 2 main leads, or do you think they had actually something to contribute to it?
I kind of love the character of Midge, right? Because again, she's like, hangdog expression, like obviously clearly in love with Jimmy Stewart, and why wouldn't you be? He's just lovely. And she's this kind of, she's talented and she's dainty and she's this little bird-like thing. But I don't ever feel like we get, apart from, as you say, that kind of flippant remark of like, oh, we were engaged, I don't ever feel like we get to know any of the other characters, because I think, or maybe this is just me, but I feel like I become swept up in the Scotty Madeline thing, and almost everyone else in the periphery, it's not that they don't matter, it's just that you do become kind of consumed by this. And I feel like even when those two kind of main characters are in scenes where there are other people, your focus is always on them, whether that's directly through camera work or it's just because nothing else seems to matter. I don't know, maybe I'm reading it wrong, but I feel like out of all the supporting characters, Midge is probably the most prominent. But again, it's kind of like, she's the not dumpy friend, that's not fair, but she's the plain friend. As I say, she's got short hair and glasses, so of course anyone looking at her next to this stunning like 20-year-old Kim Novak in the finest Edith Head suit with her hair all coiffured, nobody's going to look twice, do you know what I mean? But she's the kind of most prominent supporting character, and even then I don't feel like we get to know that much about her.
Definitely, yeah. Apart from her, there was really just the husband and briefly, I suppose, the bookseller who they went to for advice, and that was about it. He came across as some sort of ex-Nazi or something. Anyway, the way he was talking.
There was an accent going on. Yep.
There was a wee link between the name of the bookshop, which I can't remember offhand, but it had something to do with shipbuilding. The name of the bookshop.
Oh, right,
obviously, he was actually went into the shipyard to take on the job at first and everything as well, which I thought was it, because I remember looking at the name, thought I better go and look that up, and it was there are obviously small links in there. There was obviously a couple of signposted elements to the film with Marion's hair and, as I mentioned, the bouquet and the necklace. Now, for all that I love this film, I thought that was a little clumsy in the way that they actually brought these things. Not so much that they brought them to the screen the first time. They had to then reintroduce them in the form of a conversation between Scotty and his client. And he was saying, oh, have you seen the bouquet of flowers? What do you think about the hair? Have you seen that? As if you'd missed this, and you didn't really miss it, because when you get introduced to it the first time, there was a close-up of this bun in her hair. And then the camera moves up to the painting she's looking at with the bun, and you're going, right, so there's a link there. So you don't need anything else.
I get what you mean. And I don't know what the source text is like, but I almost wonder if maybe, like, was that really complex? Was that really heavy? Or is it just because, I don't know, did Hitchcock think the film was going to bomb because it was quite complex, and so therefore he did put in these kind of signposts and things? And obviously the film was a commercial failure, which coincidentally he blamed on his 2 lead stars. He said they had no chemistry, but I don't know if it was because maybe he personally thought that it was maybe a bit kind of complex, because it is quite a wild ride compared to some of the other kind of more straightforward. There's no birds attacking a bunch of kids or whatever. It is quite complex. So I feel like sometimes these things are kind of shoehorned in, and that happened as well in Rear Window, and there's kind of a wee bit of nudge, nudge, wink, wink in A Shadow of a Doubt as well, and to a certain extent Rope. But I think that I almost feel like he put it in to sort of make the film more accessible, and it's a shame because it doesn't need to be. It's a good movie, as you say. It sets its stall out very early on, so it doesn't actually need that additional, as you say, oh look, there's a bun and there's a bun. It's like it doesn't require that trust that your viewer is going to go along with this.
Going back to what you said about the chemistry between the two stars, I wasn't expecting chemistry between them in terms of a sort of traditional romance, because it's not that type of story. It's a story of obsession and deceit. So it's very difficult, and for a lot of the film, it was a one-sided obsession. Obviously, that slightly changed as the film progressed and the characters got to know each other and everything like that. But it didn't matter that they didn't click. And yes, the age gap thing, they didn't try to disguise it, though. That's the thing. I mean,
oh no, his hands are like really liver spotted. Yeah, he's got grey in his hair, but he's Jimmy Stewart. Like, why would you not be in love? Well, the thing with the chemistry is he sees her and straight away he's like, you can see the fire has been lit. Like, as you say, he does this kind of thing with his eyes, and it's like, oh my god, this guy is head over heels, straight away. Whereas she kind of spends a lot of the first kind of third of the movie, I would say, like walking about in a trance. Like, she's very, very this total icy blonde and very aloof, and she's, there's a lot of posing and like delicately looking at things and sort of pointing at, and like, I kind of agree with you. Like, there's not meant to be a chemistry there. This is very much a one-sided, totally falling in love with the subject sort of thing. It's not meant to be a great love story. Yeah,
well, I totally got that with the way that she acted within the first 2/3 of the film. There was, obviously, we're avoiding spoilers here, but there was a whole reason why she was acting that way. There was a lot of, look at me, remember what I look like, and remember what I'm doing, and remember my odd behaviour. So yes, it was icy, but there are reasons behind that. Obviously, I'm not going to go into any more detail on that. Go and watch the film, people. Watch it. Watch it now. Finish watching it, listen to us.
Aye, watch Marnie, then watch this and come back to us. I think the thing is, what I liked about it was it does, like, Hitchcock's kind of like, they always say he's kind of like, not voyeuristic, but there is this kind of like tingly, like you're looking at something that you shouldn't be looking at, like kind of the, the kind of peephole and psycho sort of thing. And I feel like that's what almost she was kind of trying to provoke, this sort of like, I know that you're looking at me, so I'm going to put on a show type of thing. And okay, it's not anything like ostentatious or crude or anything like that, but it is like, I feel like everything's very posed, and I think it sort of plays into this whole notion of Hitchcock being a voyeur or getting his kicks from, I don't know, his leading ladies or whatever. But to me, that's what it felt like.
Yeah, there is a wee bit of that. I mean, if you think about the first time that you encounter her in the restaurant, you see her on profile, and he's able to take in everything about her, so he recognises her, so he'll be able to follow her and everything. Yeah, and it's very deliberate the way it's done. It's quite soft focus and all that well, Oh yeah, there's a lot of that going on here. So. Yeah, and there's a lot of like doubling as well as the film progresses. So again, this kind of Hitchcock thing of this, like, and it happens in loads of movies, like, you chase someone through the streets and you tap them on the shoulder and turn them around and, oh no, it's the wrong person. And that happens quite a lot as well. But I think this, again, it kind of played into this whole thing of like, do you really know who she is? Is he who he says he is? And what's actually going on here? And obviously, like, I'll not go into any other spoilers to do with Dublin and stuff like that, but everything felt very like staged, and then the more sort of things unraveled, the more everything else got quite loose, and the idea of identity and what people look like and who they are, and is identity performative, and is anyone really who they say they are, or do you put on an act and whatever? And I just kind of got lost in all of that again. And I think that's why I love this movie so much, is because every time I watch it, it makes me think about, it doesn't make me think about identity, it makes me think about, gender politics, it makes me think about coercive control, it makes me think about mental health, and it's like, it's all these different things just wrapped up in this luscious red and green bubble, which, by the way, is very festive, so consider this a Christmas film. You probably could, yes. Overall, I think this is the masterpiece that a lot of people say now. There are a number of films out there that are considered masterpieces that are there. I don't know why they are, but this is one that's obviously, the passage of time, I think, has been very kind to it, and the fact that a lot of people rediscovered it and championed it as a sign that it's a good film. And as you say, the Sight and Sound 2012 poll put it at #1 for, I think that was the first time that it had actually been there. It had been up, and that's film professionals and film critics that actually vote on that. So it must be something that a film is gradually becoming more and more of an icon. It can only sort of stay there as far as I'm concerned. I don't think its stature really diminishing anyway.
Is it your favourite Hitchcock?
I think it probably is, yes. Don't want to peak too early, obviously, in our discussions. But yes, I think it's probably him and his team at the height of their powers, because everything about it, from the cinematography to the costumes to, I mean, the Bernard Herrmann score is just amazing. It's always a sign of a good score when you can just listen to it on its own and get as much as you would actually watching the visuals. And it's right from the very start, like you say, in the opening credits, score fires in. And a nice wee touch there was it started off, it's in black and white. Yeah. And then it just goes red once you get a close-up on the face. Yeah, but it's just that it seems to be everybody's sort of brought their A game to it, and it's a fantastic story as well. So it just all kind of works together. When you talk about classic Hitchcock, first thing I think of is Vertigo. There's another couple that are very close behind it, but yeah, I think this just noses it for myself. What about you?
No, I mean, my favourite film of all time, never mind my favourite Hitchcock, is Shadow of a Doubt. I am kind of obsessed with Joseph Cotton's performance in that movie. I remember the first time I watched it, it was in a cinema, and I completely freaked out. Obviously, there's kind of breaking of the fourth wall, and he looks directly down the barrel of the lens as he's talking about his murderous spree. And I just remember going, oh my God, my whole body's like shivering. I was like, I don't like this, but I couldn't stop watching it. Vertigo's definitely up there just because of the level of complexity. And that's not to shit on like Psycho and stuff like that, because they're obviously classics. But for me, when I watch this, every time I watch it, I notice something different. I feel something different, and it makes me think about different themes, not to sound like an arse about it, but it does make me it challenges me every time I watch it, and that to me is a sign of a brilliant film.
We've obviously started in a high with two very good films, which is obviously nice.
Yeah. So for anyone that was tuning in expecting like a sort of Marnie versus Vertigo, that isn't this kind of gig. We're just here to talk about our love of them and not sort of pit them against each other. We're hoping to continue this Hitchcock series on the Moviescramble podcast. If you have any ideas of films that you would like to see compared and contrast, or just chatted about in general, the email address is podcast@moviescramble.co.uk. I'm telling Simi, I got it right. And obviously, because we can't have our Moviescramble Christmas night out or go to any cinemas and stuff like that, we have time in our hands, so we're hoping to get this series up and running. But as I say, if you've got any comments or you want to see a particular Hitchcock film discussed, we are at Moviescramble on all your usual channels. It has been a pleasure. I have been Mary, and my esteemed colleague has been Big Sexy John.
Oh, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.